Emily Carter never imagined that the man living just a few feet from her porch, the quiet, polite neighbor named Roger Dean, would one day aim a gun at her in the middle of the night. What began as a small misunderstanding over a barking dog slowly twisted into a nightmare of obsession, fear, and violence in a neighborhood that seemed too peaceful for tragedy. Maple Hollow was the kind of neighborhood that belonged on a postcard. Every house looked nearly identical, lined up neatly along tree-shaded streets with tidy lawns and white fences. Families waved to one another on their morning walks, kids rode their bikes after school, and the air always carried the faint smell of fresh cut grass. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of calm that made people feel safe enough to leave their doors unlocked. When Emily Carter moved there, she thought she had finally found peace. After years of living in noisy apartments and dealing with chaotic city life, the gentle stillness of Maple Hollow felt like a fresh start. Emily worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, which meant she spent most of her time indoors with her golden retriever, Max. Her days were filled with soft background music, coffee breaks on the porch, and short walks through the neighborhood. She quickly learned her neighbors' names, exchanging friendly smiles with a retired couple across the street and chatting about the weather with the mail carrier. Everyone seemed kind, everyone except the man who lived next door. His name was Roger Dean. He was in his early 50s, tall, lean, and always wore a faded baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He rarely spoke, never smiled, and seemed to appear out of nowhere. When Emily first moved in, she tried to introduce herself, but he barely looked up, mumbling something before shutting his door. She figured he was just a private person, the type who liked to keep to himself. At first, there was nothing strange about him, just an odd sense of distance. But over time, little things began to feel off. She would catch him standing in his yard, staring not at the trees or the sky, but directly at her house. Sometimes he'd stay like that for several minutes, unmoving, before turning away. It happened often enough that Emily started to notice patterns. He always came out around the same time each evening, right before sunset, when the neighborhood grew quiet. Then came the noises. Late at night, when everything else was still, there would be soft tapping sounds, steady, deliberate, almost like hammering. Once she heard scratching at the back fence. Another time she woke to the sound of footsteps crunching in the gravel just outside her bedroom window. When she went to look, no one was there. Max would growl at the dark corners of the yard, his fur standing up, but there was never anything to see. Emily told herself it was her imagination. Every new homeowner goes through a period of nervousness, she thought, but deep down, unease began to grow. Something about Roger felt different and natural, even. His blinds were always shut tight, and his yard was too perfect, the grass trimmed to the exact same height every week. Once she noticed a camera fixed on his porch, aimed suspiciously toward her property. When she mentioned it to another neighbor, they shrugged it off, saying Roger had always been a little strange. Weeks turned into months, and the feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. Emily began double-checking her locks every night. The porch that once felt like her sanctuary now felt exposed, like a stage under a spotlight. The stillness of Maple Hollow no longer comforted her. It pressed against her chest, heavy and unnatural, carrying the silent question of what, exactly, was hiding behind her neighbor's closed blinds. It started with something so small that Emily almost laughed about it later, wondering how everything could spiral from there. One morning, Max barked non-stop when Roger was using his leaf blower. The noise echoed across the yards, and Roger looked up sharply, eyes cold and narrow. Emily waved apologetically and brought Max inside, thinking it was no big deal. But the next day, a folded piece of paper was taped to her front door. The handwriting was messy and uneven. It read, "Control your dog. This is your only warning. No name, no signature, just those words." Emily felt a chill but tried to dismiss it. Maybe Roger was just annoyed. Everyone gets frustrated sometimes. Still, she made sure to keep Max quiet, but things didn't stop there. The following week, her trash cans were found tipped over early one morning. At first, she thought maybe a raccoon had done it. Then she noticed the lids were stacked neatly beside the cans, not tossed around like an animal would have done. It was deliberate. Little acts of spite began to appear one after another. Her garden hose was sliced clean through. Her mailbox was dented as if someone had kicked it hard in the night. She started waking up to strange noises again, soft metallic clicks, like tools being used nearby. The sound always seemed to come from Roger's side of the fence. When she'd look out, she could see his porch light flick on, then off again. Emily mentioned the strange incidents to a few neighbors while out walking Max. They exchanged uneasy glances. Some of them admitted that Roger had a temper. One woman recalled how he once yelled at her husband for trimming a shared hedge without permission. Another said he defiled multiple complaints to the homeowners association about noise pollution because of children playing outside. The pattern was clear. Roger didn't like disruption. He liked control. Emily tried to ignore it. She didn't want to start a bigger problem. But soon she couldn't deny that Roger's behavior had shifted from odd to threatening. One afternoon, she caught him standing at the property line, holding a rake but doing nothing with it. He wasn't gardening or cleaning. He was just staring, motionless. When Emily made eye contact, he turned and walked away slowly without a word. That night, she thought she heard something scrape across her front window. When she went outside the next morning, she found deep marks on the glass, almost like someone had dragged a key across it. That was the moment she stopped making excuses. She started documenting everything, taking photos, saving notes, and writing down dates and times. Still, a part of her hesitated to call the police. What would she even say? My neighbor is acting strange. There was no solid proof, only instincts and a growing sense of danger she couldn't quite explain. The more she tried to stay calm, the more tightly wound she became. Every noise made her jump, every shadow made her heart race. The once peaceful rhythm of Maple Hollow began to feel tense. Even the other neighbors seemed quieter, as if they too sensed something brewing beneath the surface. Emily's life had started to revolve around the quiet feud no one else could see. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, an invisible battle fought through silence, glares, and small acts of hostility. She didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The line between paranoia and real danger was fading fast, and soon it would disappear completely. By the time October arrived, the days in Maple Hollow were shorter and the air carried the first bite of cold. Leaves fell in waves of red and gold, but the change in season did nothing to ease Emily's growing fear. What had once felt like a simple neighborly misunderstanding had turned into something darker, something she couldn't explain away anymore. Every night she checked her doors twice, sometimes 3 times. Max, her dog, had started sleeping at the foot of her bed instead of his usual spot by the window. Even he seemed uneasy. It was a Thursday evening when she came home from a quick grocery run and noticed something strange. Her porch light was out. She flipped the switch, but nothing happened. When she looked closer, she realized the bulb had been smashed, glass scattered across the wooden steps. It was small, but the meaning behind it was sharp and clear. Someone had been there. She immediately checked her security camera, but when she opened the app, there was nothing. No footage. The camera itself was gone, ripped clean off the wall, the wires dangling. Her stomach turned cold. She walked around the yard, flashlight in hand, her breath coming out in pale clouds. There were footprints near the porch steps, large and uneven. They led toward the fence separating her yard from Roger's. That night, she barely slept. Every creak of the house made her jump. The next morning, she called the local police, her voice trembling as she explained everything. 2 officers arrived later that day. They were polite but cautious, taking notes, glancing at the fence and then at Roger's house. When they knocked on his door, he eventually appeared. Emily watched from her window as they talked. He gestured, shrugged, and at one point even smiled. After a few minutes, the officers came back and told her he denied knowing anything about the camera. They advised her to keep an eye out and to call again if anything else happened. It wasn't much comfort. For a few days, things were quiet to quiet. No noises, no footprints, no new damage. Emily started to hope that maybe the police visit had scared him into stopping. But then Roger's behavior began to shift in unsettling ways. He started pacing up and down his driveway for hours, muttering under his breath. Sometimes he would stop and stare directly at Emily's house before turning and disappearing inside. Other neighbors began to notice too. Curtains moved when he walked past, and people avoided making eye contact. No one wanted to get involved. Maple Hollow, once a place of friendly smiles and shared lawn tools, had grown silent. Even the sound of kids playing had vanished. One afternoon, as Emily was taking Max for a walk, she saw Roger in his yard again. His eyes followed her the entire time, expression blank, hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. She couldn't tell if he was angry or simply watching, but something about the stillness in him was deeply wrong. She felt it in her chest, a tension that wouldn't ease. That evening, she noticed the faint glow of a light flickering in Roger's upstairs window. It stayed on for hours, then went dark all at once. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that he was preparing for something. The calm of Maple Hollow had become the kind of quiet that warned of a coming storm, and deep down, she knew the worst was still ahead. The night it happened was colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes every sound sharper. Emily had settled onto the couch with a blanket and a mug of tea, trying to ignore the uneasy quiet outside. Max lay beside her, occasionally lifting his head to listen. The neighborhood was still, the street lamps casting long, pale shadows over the pavement. It felt like every house was asleep, but under that stillness, there was a tension she couldn't name. Around 9 o'clock, a sudden crash broke the silence. It came from outside, sharp and heavy like metal hitting concrete. Max leapt to his feet, barking wildly. Emily's heart raced as she peered through the window. At first, she couldn't see anything. Then she noticed a faint glow near the street her mailbox was smoking. She opened the door cautiously and stepped out onto the porch. The smell of something burning hit her immediately. Someone had set fire to her mail. She rushed back inside, grabbed a bucket of water from the kitchen, and ran out again. The fire was small, just a few flickering flames around the edge of the box. As she poured the water, the sudden crack of a gunshot split the night. It was so loud that for a second her mind refused to believe what had happened. Then came the second shot. Pain tore through her shoulder, hot and blinding. She stumbled, dropping the bucket, and fell onto the cold grass. Max barked furiously, circling her, his growls echoing into the night. Somewhere nearby, she heard footsteps pounding against the pavement, then silence. Her vision blurred, but she could still make out the dark outline of Roger's house, his porch light flickering faintly. She tried to move, but the pain was overwhelming. Her hands were slick with blood, the metallic scent thick in the air. Neighbors started to emerge from their homes, shouting for help, calling her name. Someone yelled to call 911. Lights began to flick on up and down the street. Within minutes, police sirens pierced the night, flashing red and blue against the trees. Paramedics rushed to her side, voices urgent but calm, trying to keep her awake. Emily drifted in and out of consciousness as they lifted her onto a stretcher. Across the street, police surrounded Roger's house. They knocked, shouted commands, but there was no response. The standoff lasted for hours. No one dared move closer. The residents of Maple Hollow watched from behind curtains, the quiet street now a scene of chaos. Finally, as dawn approached, the SWAT team broke down his door. Inside, they found Roger in his basement. The room was cluttered with old newspapers, tools, and papers scattered everywhere. On the walls were pages filled with handwritten notes, lists of names, complaints, and drawings of houses on the street, including Emily's. One corner of the wall had the words they never stopped scribbled over and over again. Roger sat silently on a chair when they found him, staring at nothing. He didn't resist when they placed him in handcuffs. Emily survived the night, but everything she knew about safety shattered in an instant. The neighborhood that once felt like a dream now felt cursed, haunted by the echo of gunfire that would never quite fade. Emily woke up days later in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and quiet. The first thing she noticed was the dull ache in her shoulder and the soft rhythm of the heart monitor beside her bed. For a few moments, she couldn't remember what had happened. Then it came back in fragments: the fire, the gunshots, the cold ground beneath her hands. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. A nurse told her she was lucky to be alive. The bullet had missed an artery by less than an inch. Outside the hospital, the story spread quickly. News crews arrived at Maple Hollow, cameras capturing the street that once symbolized suburban calm. Reporters called it the Maple Hollow shooting. Neighbors gave interviews, describing Roger as quiet but strange, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some claimed they had always sensed something off about him, while others admitted they ignored the signs. Everyone wanted to talk now, though none had spoken when it mattered. Roger was taken into custody after the standoff ended. When police searched his house, they found more than anyone expected. Not just the handwritten notes, but boxes of audio recordings labeled with dates, some going back years. He had been listening to the sounds of the neighborhood: the lawn mowers, dogs barking, people laughing. Each recording came with angry comments written on the cases, complaints about the noise, about disrespect, about being watched. There was no doubt anymore that Roger's mind had unraveled long before the shooting. Doctors later declared him mentally unfit to stand trial. Instead of prison, he was sent to a secure psychiatric facility. For some, that felt like justice. For others, it felt like a loophole. The neighbors couldn't stop wondering how none of them had seen how dangerous he had become. For Emily, it didn't matter where he was. What haunted her wasn't the thought of Roger himself, but how close she had come to dying without anyone realizing the danger until it was too late. When she finally returned home weeks later, Maple Hollow didn't look the same. The lawns were still neat, the houses still in perfect rows, but the sense of safety had vanished. People greeted each other with careful smiles, their conversations shorter and more guarded. Some residents installed new locks and cameras, others moved away quietly. The neighborhood that once prided itself on being peaceful now carried an invisible scar. Emily tried to settle back into her routine. She repainted her porch, replaced the broken light, and took longer walks with Max, but every creak of the fence and every flicker of light made her tense. At night, she sometimes woke to the sound of footsteps in her dreams, convinced someone was outside. The bullet wound healed, but the fear stayed. Months passed, and eventually, Emily decided to move. She found a small house on the edge of another town, quiet, but not too quiet. Before she left, she stood one last time in her old yard, staring at the fence that had once divided her from Roger's home. The new owners had already started renovating his property, repainting the walls and cutting back the overgrown bushes. It looked almost normal again, as if nothing terrible had ever happened there. But Emily knew that some things don't fade with a fresh coat of paint. Some memories stay buried beneath the surface, waiting in the silence. When she finally drove away from Maple Hollow, she didn't look back. The street that had once promised safety now felt like a warning. It reminded her that evil doesn't always announce itself with noise or chaos. Sometimes it hides behind curtains, blending into the quiet, waiting for the perfect moment to be seen.